Well, hey folks, I'm Josh. Welcome back to the shop. Today we're going to talk about all the parts of a Swiss Army knife. When I first started doing this, I found that there was a lot of terms and things that I didn't know, and I thought it might be useful for folks that are first starting to kind of look at doing Swiss Army knife modifications or just want to know more about their knife kind of thing. It would be useful to know all the different parts and kind of see where they are on the knife and things like that. So I'm just going to kind of go through the basic overall anatomy of a Swiss Army knife. I'm going to focus on the 91mm models because I think those are probably the most popular, and they're also very, very similar to the 93mm models, like the Pioneer X, the Farmer, that kind of thing. Really, really similar. They're just a little longer. But the overall design is really similar. It's just on those 93mm, no back tools, which is what you would call all the tools on this side of the knife. So like on a 91mm, it's either Phillips screwdriver or a corkscrew and the awl, and lots of times the hook. So no back tools on a 93mm knife, and it's also really similar to the 84mm knives, such as a Cadet, which this is the Alox, so is the 93mm. I don't think I have an 84mm that has normal scales, so I can't show you one of those, but the same basic setup. All that happens is they just move the make them a little longer or a little shorter, but the overall idea is basically the same. So the first thing to talk about on these models is on most of the 91mm models, you'll have this part of the knife that you see on the outside. These are called scales, and they are removable. They end up looking something like this. One side has the emblem pressed in, and yes, that will actually come out. If you look on the back side of the scale there, if you were to push right there with a pin or a toothpick or something like that, it would pop that emblem right back out. And they're actually kind of tricky to put back in, so I don't recommend popping them out unless you mean to, but it is possible to put them back in. On the scales, you have a few scale tools. Typically, you see the tweezers and you see the toothpick. That's probably the most common things to see in there, but there are other things that you can put in there. They make little fire starters and other odd things, and those are on the standard scales. If you get a knife with what's called the plus scales, you get the tweezers, the toothpick, and then they also have a little ballpoint pen in there, which is pretty handy. So if you have the plus scales, you'll see that little guy added on there. Most of the scales are made from a plastic, I believe it's called celluloid. Yeah, but you can get some with nylon, but these shiny ones, that's all celluloid. You can get it in red, you can get it in black, green, blue, all that stuff. And then sometimes you can find customized ones with goofy designs on them. Like this is one from Smoky Mountain Knife Works, and that's I got it because I thought it was hysterical. So you can get all kinds of different scales. And when you pop the scales off, you'll get a knife that looks something like this. And this is what's underneath that, and you can see a couple of things at this point. On the sides here, these plates are actually called a side plate, and they look like this when you take them off. And they're not completely flat. They actually have, if you look really close, well, they're raised a little bit. You can kind of see right there, it sticks up a little. It does that on the other side too, and that's to allow a little bit of clearance for the blades and stuff as they close it. So anyway, the side plates are not completely flat, worth noting. And the side plates sandwich the whole knife together. And one way that you determine what type of knife you're looking at is the number of layers that a knife has. So this was once a Tinker. It has 2 layers, meaning you have a layer that has the blades, and then you have the opener layer. So that's 2 layers. And then whatever back tool. So on this one, it's a Phillips and an awl. You can get anywhere from 2 to, I have no idea. Some of the big Swiss Champ XLTs or whatever have, I have no idea how many layers they have. They get ridiculous. They get like this wide. This is a Swiss Champ. It's an 8-layer knife, and that's pretty big. But you know, that's one way to tell if you're trying to figure out what knife do I have. You count the number of layers, and that's one place to start. The SAK wiki Swiss Army Knife wiki, SAK wiki, is a really good place to help identify knives and figure things out like that. So you count your number of layers, that's one place to start. And then you start looking at the specific tools. The knives are held together with, if you look at this guy here, these brass, they're technically a rivet, I guess, but a lot of people will call them a pin. The reason they're not called a pin is because they are flared. If you take one out, so you can kind of see how the top of that is flared. They're flared and peened, as opposed to a knife that is pinned. A true pin is like you can see in this buck knife. There is a tiny, it's a little bit slightly different color right there. That is actually the pin in this knife, and it's not flared. It just fits down in there. So that, I mean, technically that's a pin, and technically this is a rivet with the enlarged head. But if you get to looking around and talking on the forums and stuff, people will call these pins, people will call them rivets. There's, you know, it's almost interchangeable, but I think technically it's called a rivet. And then the rivets, actually, so they're flared, and then on 3 of these, at least on the models that have scales, have bushings around. So if you were to take this off, you can see there would be a bushing. So what happens is the pin, here's an example, the bushing slides up, and that's what kind of helps even more put pressure on the outside of the knife. So there's a bushing on those spots right there. This one is just riveted. There is no bushing on that particular rivet, but these ones have a bushing on each side. And if you're taking your knife apart, be very, very careful not to damage those bushings and don't lose them, because you will want to reuse them unless you're planning on doing something with screws or getting new ones or something like that. So that's what holds the knife together. Swiss Army knives are considered a slip joint knife, and what that means is the blades and tools are all held in with a spring. And don't think like a coil spring like you would think of, like, I don't know, in a pen or whatever. It's not that kind of spring. It's a spring. You can see it in this example here. The spring is this part right here. And this is considered actually a floating spring because it doesn't have a pin that goes through it. It just sits around all these parts. So the blades are held either closed by the tension that is on this spring, or they are held open by the tension that is on that spring. So you can see that makes this a slip joint knife because it has that kind of back spring to it. Other examples, there's tons of different types of knives out there, but one example would be this lockback knife that has this locking mechanism, and that's what holds the blade open. You can have blades like this one here. This is a CRKT pillar, and it's called a frame lock knife. You can see what holds it open is this part of the frame. Actually, as you open it, clicks over and holds the blade open. So there's no back spring on this knife. There's no spring back here that puts tension on that blade. It actually can move fairly freely. If I would clean it up and oil it a little bit, it could move really freely in this space. So there's no tension on that, and what holds it open is that spring right there, and there's actually a little ball in there that hits and holds it kind of closed. So lots of different types of knives, but Swiss Army knife, most of them fall into the slip joint knife category. So if you go even further and you drill out your rivets, remove those, and you get your side plate off, you will find layers of tools that look something like this, and there's all kinds of different combinations. This is a pretty typical blade layer, you'd call it. You have a big blade, small blade, there's a spacer. So let's take this small blade off. Sometimes there's spacers. In particular in this layer, there's a little spacer because the small blade is thinner than the big blade, so you need a little spacer to make up for that difference in width. And then on the back side, the back tool on this layer is typically a Phillips or a corkscrew. That's probably the most common. I don't know that I've seen anything else. I'm sure there's an exception, but those are the two you see the most. And then each layer has a basically standard set of tools that go in that layer. Between many of the layers, you will see this. This is a liner. And the liners go between most of the layers, not all of the layers, but most of the layers have a liner that separates them. You can see they're the part that's less shiny. But for example, on the Swiss Champ, The fish scaler and the wood saw actually don't have a liner between them. They just have the springs and the tools sitting right next to each other, but that works out because of the amount of clearance they have. But typically there's liners between the layers, and they're all cut a little different to allow different tools and spaces, things like that. So anyway, hope this was helpful, and I will do some further videos on some of the basic things that you can do to change out stuff on your knife and make modifications, stuff like that. Like, subscribe, and I will see you next time.